Good day, everyone. I hope everyone's well, and welcome to Data Matters, episode 7. I'm Vicky Gilwar, and I'm joined today by my business partner, Steve Wright.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're listening in from.
Thank you, Steve. Today, we'll be unpacking the topic of data subject rights, one of the 12 domains of our privacy culture framework, and of course, Articles 15 to 22 of the GDPR. We're delighted to be joined today by Matthew Kay. Hello, Matthew.
Hi, Vicky. Hi, everyone.
Welcome. Matthew is the DPO EMEA for Thomson Reuters. So, it's been another busy week in the world of data privacy and cybersecurity. Steve spent yesterday following The Sun, hosting PrivSec's inaugural online conference last Thursday in privacy, and I believe they're going to repeat that on a monthly basis now. I was delighted to be part of a panel looking at data breach prevention and response, a topic we'll be exploring in the coming weeks. And also, I was looking at harmonisation of GCC country data protection laws. In both cases, of course, the current COVID-19 crisis was front and centre, and I know it was the same for Steve in his sessions as well. And of particular note is the need to share health data globally. That's, of course, in the public interest right now. It'll be interesting to learn, though, later on whether or not that data was adequately protected and used for the intended purpose, and also interesting to see whether data subjects can enact their rights against that data. In all these cases, of course, it will be particularly difficult where data protection laws might not be in place, might not be very mature, or indeed, let alone harmonised within a region. Regulators have said they'll take a pragmatic approach during this period, but we'll wait and see what that actually means in practice if there have been any significant infringements of data subject rights. So let's go over to our experts to begin extracting their views. I'm going to begin by asking of you, Matthew. Let's look at what are the data subject rights. So what are they and how have they changed since the introduction of the GDPR?
So I think at a highest level, it's about giving individuals essentially defined as data subjects within the GDPR. So people essentially a right of access to their information. So there's a defined set of rights that allows individuals to do different things in respect of their data in relation to how they're being processed by organisations. So you've got your right of access, which is essentially your right of access to information, types of data being processed by organisations, where that's been sourced from, how it's being used, how it's being stored, and how long it'll be kept for. You've then got a right to rectification. So if you feel something is being held in error or is inaccurate, you can request a right to have that rectified. You've got the right to erasure, which is essentially derived from the case in terms of Google Spain, where there was a right to be forgotten. Individuals were granted a right to be forgotten on the back of that case through Google Spain, and now individuals can use that more broadly if they feel information's held that shouldn't be held, or they don't want it held any longer by the organisation, and they can request for that information to be deleted, subject to certain provisions depending on whether organisations can continue to hold that for, say, a legal right. You've also got a right to restrict processing, a right to object. So essentially restricting how data is processed by organisations, or if you're unhappy with how they are processing it, you can raise a right to objection. And another key right is automated decision making, including profiling. So if individuals have had a decision taken automatically by an organisation, essentially say a computer has taken a decision on their behalf, it could be to do with a credit application, maybe for a new bank account or credit card, and individuals are unhappy with the outcome, they can request for a human to review that. I think the main changes we've sort of seen since GDPR are previously under the previous data protection regime in the UK, you had the Data Protection Act 1998. So there was a right of access in terms of a subject access request, but as a result of that, we've seen a removal of the £10 fee. We've seen a reduced time frame for response, and we've also seen an increase in user awareness, leading to an increase in requests across organisations. And I think I mentioned earlier, the right to be forgotten is now a lot more explicit. It's a lot broader. It applies to all organisations, and it's something that all organisations have to handle in respect of requests and consider how they will respond to them. And then you've got the right of data portability, right to object, and right to rectification, which I previously mentioned. And data portability, I think, is quite narrow. It doesn't necessarily apply to all organisations, but it can be a key component for some in terms of consumer rights. So if individuals, say, wanted to move between gas or electricity suppliers, the ideology behind the data portability principle is that individuals can have their information moved quite readily and freely. I guess it's similar to how, say, banks may offer a transfer of service provider. The idea is that individuals can move that from maximum sort of satisfaction in consumer rights and minimal hassle and red tape. And I think in terms of looking at the GDPR and the ideology behind it, was essentially sort of a harmonisation of rights. So the idea has been that there will be consistency now in terms of how individuals' rights are applied across Europe, whereas previously we operated under a directive. So we would see different member states incorporate the legislation independently. We are now hopefully seeing organisations apply individuals' rights in a more consistent manner, subject to interpretation, of course, from organisations and also the different regulatory authorities.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. I think that was a really good explanation and introduction, particularly to people that might not have heard that before. Steve, I just want to pick up on the last point really that Matthew made in terms of harmonisation across Europe. Do you think the way that these rights have been applied is actually good? Has it been good for individuals?
Good question, Vic. I suppose there's two parts to your question there. There's one about the harmonisation, and then I'll come to whether or not it's been good for individuals. This GDPR, as we know, one of the challenges that we had with the 95 directive from the EU, which then obviously got enshrined into the 1998 Data Protection Act, was that it allowed for countries to basically implement their version of it or their interpretation of it. So it allowed for, I think unwittingly, but it allowed for each countries to decide how to what extent, the directive was going to be applied within their respective countries, and that's fine, but when you're talking about a common, if you like, policy around digital harmonisation and a level playing field for competition, and opening up the frontiers, if you like, to have the common market that we've decided to opt out of, figuratively speaking. The principle behind it was right, and I think what we've got now is a much more joined up, and there are still localized versions and considerations that have to be taken into account, like France's employment laws, which are quite stringent, and the 16 states of Germany, which each have their own interpretation. So there are still local nuances, but one thing's for sure is that not just within the EEA, but wider across the globe, and certainly I was on a call yesterday with some experts on the India data protection bill, which has just been pushed out a little bit given the current crisis. But the the implications of GDPR are wide-reaching, they're global. So I think what's happened is GDPR has allowed a sort of almost minimum best practice around rights and freedoms of the individual, and that's had this ripple effect. So harmonisation, to your first point, sorry, it was a long-winded explanation, but the harmonisation point is exactly what's happened, and as GDPR has facilitated that, not just within Europe but globally, and that's been really helpful. And I go back now to, has it been a benefit of to individuals, and for me and for all of the customers that I served when I was CPO for Unilever and then subsequently for John Lewis, is a resounding yes. I think the whole principle behind it, the understanding the lawfulness, being fair and transparent, and limiting the purpose by which you handle that data, collect that data, use that data, has really been enshrined in the regulation, and the rights that I feel empowered now that even with dealing with local issues here in my county, I feel as if I now have a right to go and ask for certain information about myself, or some of the companies that I didn't even know had my data. I now feel empowered to ask them for the right to be forgotten, or to change the preferences or the data they hold about me, and having that assurance that has to be done within a month really fills me with a lot more comfort, I suppose, as a consumer. So long-winded answer, but yes, harmonisation, and yes, I think individuals by and large this has been good for them.
Excellent. No, I think that was really, really helpful. Thank you, Steve. And I guess I was hearing what you were saying about transparency and purpose limitation and that kind of thing. So, Matthew, do you think that the need to be able to fulfil these rights is helping to promote accountability and transparency within organisations?
I would say undoubtedly yes, because since and well before the introduction of GDPR, there was an increased profile in terms of data protection and privacy. There was a big push for organisations to put in place compliance programs prior to the introduction of GDPR, and I think that focus has continued really in terms of looking at what organisations can do to improve how they process personal information, and subsequently how can they respond to requests. And I think that increased profile and awareness is twofold, because it's not only increased the sort of profile and presence for organisations, it's increased the profile and presence for individuals as well. So I think we are now seeing a lot better user awareness in terms of how data, how their data is used, what they can expect, what they're entitled to, what they can challenge. And I think as a result of that, it requires organisations to step up to the plate. And I think it's not easy either, because a lot of organisations are battling sort of historic bad practice, archaic systems, a lack of understanding, a lack of benefit in terms of personal data, in terms of understanding the benefits to holding information in a particular way and making sure you keep good records, management of data. And I think the shift we've seen from sort of firstly the internet coming in to the subsequent involvement of social media and increased awareness in terms of profiling, scrutinization, obviously that in respect to what Snowden put out there a few years ago, there's a real sort of concern, skepticism in terms of how data is now used. And in that quantum shift that we've seen, I think it's very, very hard for organisations to just sort of flick a switch and the records are suddenly in order, suddenly well kept, well managed. And that, I think, is the real challenge and disconnect in terms of what GDPR has brought about and what organisations can actually do.
Excellent, thank you, Matthew. And I want both of you really to pick up on the next point, but I think it's just leading on from what you were saying around it's such a huge job for organisations to do, and of course it's going to be hard for some organisations to operationalise this. So let's start with you, Steve. What are some of the problems that organisations have fulfilling these data subject rights?
Well, interestingly, this question keeps coming up, or this point, I should say, keeps coming up, and it has done throughout my career, in fact, as a privacy officer, and that's three things really. I mean, and I'll come back to my specific experiences a bit later if we have time. But the biggest challenge that all DPOs are facing is resources. And what we mean by that is that it's all very well being able to write policy and create, documentation and guidelines, etc. It is quite a different thing having the skills to understand business process, to understand database structures, and design these privacy attributes, if you like, into the business as usual operations. And that's what I mean by resources. And I think that's where it's we've really been struggling. There are some fantastic privacy lawyers that I've worked with and learnt a great deal from in the past, where we've always come a cropper, if you like, is then how do we get from, okay, we've made a decision to do this, to actually implement that. And that's the bit where I think is a big pain point for all DPOs and CPOs globally. I think the second point that I would say is around just the huge quantity, and it sounds like I'm contradicting what I said about harmonisation, but the huge quantity of data protection regulation. Now you can buy and lie, but just generally speaking, you've got the same principles enshrined in most of those laws. So, lawfulness, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, and all those kind of good things. And of course, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But what I'm talking about is the complexity of localization laws and retention laws and employment laws and health and safety laws and all these financial services regulations that is heaped on top of that. And I think the danger there is that this, like anything for DPOs, is that this huge burden of all the different regulations makes organizations believe that this is simply a compliance activity and that it is a tick in the box, which is why you could arguably say, and now I'm going off on one, I know, but why you could arguably say that you had this huge ramp up to GDPR and then this massive downturn following GDPR, where everyone thinks, well, we've done that now, it's like Y2K, it's like SOX, we've done that now, that's now a compliance issue, surely we've got to tick the box. And both Matthew and I know as DPOs that no, this is just the beginning, because we've got to change the hearts and the minds. We've got to change the processes in our organizations to be much more effective at implementing privacy or baking privacy into everything that we do and they do. And then the third issue, this is a promise, this is all related to data rights. The third issue is still around buy-in. So, I've come off from 2 client calls this morning, and really both of them, once again, have explained to me in different ways to very different organizations about how they're struggling to get the the buy-in from the top. And what I mean by that is lots of organizations have cybersecurity as one of the top three, if not the first. Well, now it'd be COVID, obviously, but one of the big risk factors at the top of their risk register. But ask them to explain what they mean by privacy and compliance, then they sort of start to scratch their head and go, well, I don't know, it's just a compliance, it's a piece of law, we've got to comply, right? So just kind of go away and do it. And I think the challenge we've got now in our community is getting those senior leaders on those boards educated on what do we mean by privacy, what's enshrined in privacy, what's the fundamental purpose and reason why we've got this piece of regulation and law. And that is empowerment. That is to fundamentally change the way that we consider personal data. And I think that, if you like, is what's still struggling for Matthew and for every other DPO that we have, that I speak to on a daily basis and who are guests on our show. And by the way, thank you, Matthew, for agreeing to come on our show.
I'm doing fine, by the way, Steve.
It's great. It's great to have you. So to answer your question, Vic, this whole challenge, this whole accountability and transparency thing is really hard, because implementing these rights, building all of these processes like the privacy by design and building Europa and everything, but putting that, operationalizing it, just like the rights, is where it really gets hard, and it's just made harder by the complexity, by the lack of good quality resources, practical resources, and the senior leadership's buy-in and level of understanding about what this actually encompasses.
Absolutely, thanks, Steve. Yeah,
that was me going off one. Apologies.
No, I think it's really helpful, well articulated, and I think it's back to Matthew's point really around awareness again. As you say, it's just keeping it front and centre to make sure that senior leadership recognise that this is an ongoing thing. It wasn't a project that finished in May 2018. So with all that in mind, it's been a couple of years now. Matthew, can I ask you, what would you say good looks like in this area? I mean, clearly, we've mentioned that potentially organisations might still be struggling with fulfilment. So, what advice can you give around what a good rights enactment process would look like operationally?
I mean, referring back to what Steve said, I think he picked up on two really important points. One being the challenge of operationalizing the data protection and privacy model, because anyone can draft a policy or procedure, and I can speak pretty well to that, having sat on the other side of the fence, and far be it from me to berate my previous employer, but I would certainly say do as I say is a lot easier than do as I do. And from a regulatory point, the ICO plays a key role, and it's very important, but I think it's a real different skill and art to be able to look at what is required and influence an organisation, particularly if they're commercially focused, to take data protection and privacy as a key area, really, in terms of how you sell and get that senior leadership buy-in, which I think is the other key point. Because I think, from my point of view, regardless of data protection, privacy, whatever it may be, everything in my eyes falls apart or comes together on the back of either good or bad governance models. And I think if you have that kind of top tier buy-in and driving force in terms of from the executive team, then it's going to flow down. There's a lot of talk in terms of the DPO reporting to the most senior level of management, which naturally will be the CEO. I think a lot of a lot of the time the CEO is a figurehead and an overseer of an organisation. You've obviously got the executive team where there'll be key stakeholders in respect of data protection and privacy, like IT, procurement. If the DPO can report into one of those, then that's great, but equally sometimes organisations won't give it that level of gravitas. So I think what you're looking for as a bare minimum is access to the boardroom and exposure. So one of my previous organisations that I worked at, something that I brought in place alongside reporting into my boss that was the head of compliance, I created a role which is more predominantly known in the public sector, but can occupy a role in the private sector as well, because it essentially means the same thing, and it's the role of a CIRO, which is the senior information risk owner. And that is basically the board level person who has accountability for data protection and privacy. And by doing that, it gave me the access and gravitas to get the drive and traction for things to be done, because fundamentally when I go into an organisation, I think it's very key to get amongst it, understand what needs to be done, build relationships with key stakeholders, and then I start to group people into three subsets essentially. The first subset are the people who just get it straight away, and we love those people because you're pushing at an open door. There's then the next set of people where with the right kind of training and guidance, they will then come on board, and they're fine too. The hardest challenge are the people that just don't want to buy into it and don't want to do the right thing, and you essentially need that sledgehammer, hard hitting sort of approach to get those people over the line as well. And I think that is the real challenge. And I think if you don't have that top level gravitas and influence, you're gonna always have a major gap within your organization. So whether in your own right you can get that influence yourself, that's brilliant, but sometimes you need to bring in a bit more firepower just to get things over the line. So I think, you know, it's the obvious stuff in terms of smooth processes, strong accountability, regular review of processing, learning from mistakes as well. You know, we have to be open and be fair that we won't always get things right, but there's key lessons always to be learned from things that happen, and it's making change on the back of that. So I think that those are the key things really.
Great, thank you, Matthew. I think that was really helpful advice. Steve, before we start to go to the questions, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
What, just on what good looks like?
Yeah, just on what good looks like.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I think that's why, you know, I have a lot of admiration for Matthew and for others who have made the transition from the policy side of the fence over to the if you like, the world where you have to roll up your sleeves, and I think that that experience of both sides is really helpful, and which is why it's successful and now the DPO at Thomson Reuters. The question of what good looks like is actually one of those really elusive ones, because it's slightly ambiguous. Now, that said, we have personally worked on and created a methodology for evaluating your level of maturity, which we call the GDPR maturity framework, and that has allowed me and the team that work with us to compare across 30 plus different organizations now what some of those good practices look like in different areas. And I would say that typically there are weaknesses in the areas where you would almost expect them to be. And so I'll just touch on a couple of those. This sounds like I'm being more on the negative side, but I'm not. You know, if you think about privacy by design, the whole concept of that, like what we did at John Lewis, was create a privacy playbook, because you're talking about conceptual, architectural ideas and concepts, you know, whether that's an application or or a new process, whatever it is. Sometimes, you know, the constraints or you know, trying to define that at an early stage is just not possible. You sit there with solution architects and they've got white pieces of paper, and for a good reason, because they don't want to presuppose anything. And I think that's a big area where we're going to find more. And COVID actually, interestingly, and I'm watching this daily, as it, you know, we've got Australia gone live with their app. You've got a plethora of other countries sitting on the fence, UK, you know, trying, and other countries testing, and I think, Holland, our Dutch colleagues, you know, just decided to do a bit of a U-turn at the last minute. And so you've got all of these countries that are right in the midst of that challenge around how do we balance ethics and privacy with a very real problem of learning about how this disease is transferred, and how it can spread and how we can contain it, you know, and obviously that's linked into part of the exit, or Lexit, as I've nicknamed it, you know, lockdown exit, and you know, and then so the privacy people that are in there at the moment, you know, advising the governments, these academics, these lawyers, I think is really hard, because for the first time they're actually having to think how privacy can be designed into something that has never been asked to be done before, and that's really where privacy is lacking maturity. So in some ways, COVID is actually going to help us mature what we mean by privacy by design. So that's a good thing. I think the other area is around compliance. Now, I've got to be really careful here, because, as you know, we are agnostic in terms of privacy culture, that is, in terms of software providers, and we work with lots of them, and they're brilliant, and they've got pluses and they've got minuses, right? You know, having been in this industry for a while now, you know, there are some really good, clever stuff. But I think compliance is one of those maturity issues which is difficult, because as an industry, we haven't yet matured what we mean in terms of KPIs or sort of measurements in the respective areas of privacy, you know. So whether that's retention or whether that's in data processing agreements, we haven't defined what good looks like, and you know, we have as privacy culture, but that's not out there. It's not widespread. It's not known. It's not like you know, in IT world we had COBIT, and we've had ITIL, and we've had all of those advancements and whole institutes working on that, and yet we just don't have that we don't have an Institute of Privacy. You know, we've got the American not-for-profit organisation, which does do a fantastic job in educating us and that sort of thing, but it's not working to solve the problems. It's just facilitating. And you know, we've got some leading universities like Queen Mary and Maastricht, and the Dutch one, Tilbury. So there are centres of excellence which are doing this, but there's not one, or it's not coming together as one. So we're going to continue to have this void of KPIs, of measurements of what good looks like. And then final point is that you know, we've got this ISO 27701, which is built on the premise of the ISMS of ISO 27001, right, which we're both very familiar with. And that is the whole Plan, Do, Check, Act, and that's all very good, and it talks about management system, and now the privacy version of that to tie in with that. The challenge I have with that, and don't get me wrong, because I'll be interested to work with a company who wanted to achieve that, but the challenge with that is a bit like ISO 27001. The scope of it became so reduced that the effectiveness of it was, you know, you could say, oh, we're ISO 27001, and yet only your data center or a subset of your data center was actually ISO 27001. So it kind of lost the plot, if you like, and people had false sense of security that, oh, we take security seriously. Well, we do in this tiny part on this division, in this, you know, so it moves down, as Matthew said, to down the lowest common denominator. So I'm not sure if I sort of answered your question or if I've added more.
No, I think thank you, Steve. I think it has been really helpful from both of you to sort of pick up on these key points around, you know, that continuity of knowledge at the leadership level, around accountability of, you know, more mature organisations, in fact, looking at KPIs for measurement, because you know, that's what's expected of us at the board level, isn't it? This has been going on a while. You know, how are you measuring how well we're doing against this? But just as we're going to questions now and thinking about where we're going to leave people, the two questions that have come up are very, very practical in terms of their requirements. So there are, you know, clearly organisations still actually grappling with practical implementation of these procedures. So I'll ask the questions and then perhaps we can round out with some of your practical top tips. So the first question is, does the right to access apply to email content from an employee perspective? For example, 2 emails between employees that mention an individual. Does everything need to be redacted apart from their name, or is it wider? Matthew, do you want to start to answer that question, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think you should always start from a point of transparency, and if you've been willing to put something in writing that relates to an individual, then you should do that with the expectation that it could be disclosed at a later date. And I think that should be outside of subject access, data protection, privacy. I think, you know, it's just, you know, if you put your name to something, I think you've got to be prepared to explain and elaborate why you have put it. Equally, on the flip side, there are certain instances where you might not want to provide that information, and there may be an exemption under the GDPR or the Data Protection Act 2018, which is derived from the GDPR, that allows you not to do so. So I think the key is to review the content with your experts within the organisation, seek outside counsel if you're still unsure and you are the DPO person, and then ultimately take a decision and document why you have made that decision, because sometimes you won't always disclose the information that you're required to. The individual may challenge it and you may take a different view. You may go to the regulator and you may still choose to say you don't think you should provide it and explain why. They may agree or they may disagree, and if they disagree, a lot of the time you will see the similar sorts of issues and instances crop up. So it's about learning from that experience and aligning your position appropriately next time. So I think, as a sort of circle back to, start from a position of you are going to provide it, but if there's a compelling reason not to, just for instance, the individual is being investigated as part of a criminal investigation, if say providing that information was going to tip them off about that investigation or prejudice it, it might not be appropriate to do so. And that's just one instance. There are many other sort of nuances or reasons why you may not choose to provide information, and it could involve a third party's information, but again, that's not always a reason not to provide it. If it's reasonable to do so in the circumstance, then it would be appropriate to provide that as well. For instance, if I made a subject access request for information that my manager say commented on my performance, even though it involves her as a third party, I would think it would still be appropriate in the instance to provide it.
Great, thank you, Matthew. And question 2, does the panel have any tools that will help e-discovery when reviewing the mass amounts of emails we have to deal with as an employer? Now, I know we don't want to state a preference, but even if not tools, methodologies, suggestions, I think people are just looking for, you know, what is the best way, what's the way that you've actually found to be most helpful in this situation. Steve, would you like to?
Yeah, I don't mind. I mean, as my disclaimer, as I mentioned earlier, was you know, we are organisationally agnostic about which providers we work with, for a very good reason, because ultimately we're there to help organisations realise privacy embedded into their organisation, operationalise. That's our goal, and obviously, you know, culture, training, and awareness is a fundamental part to that. So, but in terms of your specific question that's come through about e-discovery, there are open source tools out there, and there are also some very powerful tools, and I have worked with a couple of them. I'm not going to mention them. If you message me privately on LinkedIn, I'll let you know what they were. And they are very helpful because you can set them running, and you know, and point them in a direction, and hey presto, you know, days or weeks later you get a nice list. That said, I would say the caveat to that is when I joined John Lewis and I met with the e-com director, Suzanne, I asked her how many data sets that she had, because we needed to understand where the data was coming in to John Lewis and how people were signing up, etc. And she said there's 6 ways that we currently sign people up. There's 6, you know, channels, if you like. And it turned out that there were in fact 22 channels, because and that wasn't a e-discovery tool. That was plain old, you know, good old process, business analysts looking, understanding the user journeys, understanding, sitting with the teams, with the call centers, you know, sitting in the branches, and basically mapping what the process was, where we had all these opportunities to sign customers up. So from 6 to 22 is quite a big jump. So my point there is e-discovery tools are critical, and especially for the maintenance of SARs, because obviously with certain tools you can redact as well. And we did use that at John Lewis in the end. But I think for the initial analysis, I'm just saying, my advice would be use a blend of both process orientated review as well as e-discovery. That's all I'm saying. So just balance them both, because sometimes, you know, if you take you know, Thomson Reuters or any organisations, or Unilever, you know, Unilever, we were in 190 countries. There's, you know, it was a nightmare. We couldn't just set the discovery off. We actually had to do in country, in different jurisdictions actually, and we grouped them up, and we gave them the instructions and the methodology, and then we sent them the what to do and how to do it, and they went off and did our discovery for us. So we were reliant on them to give us the accurate information, but we couldn't do it. It would have cost us millions of pounds to do that analysis. So we did that manually. Anyway, sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
So just before we wrap up, and thank you both, it was really, really insightful, I'm sure, for the audience too. Matthew, is there any final advice from your experience that you would like to give your fellow DPOs that might be grappling with the topic?
I think Steve mentioned a really important point when he was asked about the data discovery, that essentially there are similarities between organisations, but there are differences as well. And I think it's really key to know your organisation, know your board's risk appetite, understand what their key objectives are, and position your data protection and privacy programme around that, because if you can align it to the overall strategic direction of an organization, that is how you're going to get maximum output and add maximum value. And in the places, different organizations I've worked, different organizations I've visited when I've worked for the ICO, I've seen a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences, and that can be to do with volumes of data, nature of data, commercial objectives, budget, resource, and all those things need to shape your decision making. So I think going back to what Steve was saying earlier around ISO 27001, those type of frameworks are really good as a starting point, but you then need to take that framework on and interpret it in terms of your own organization and how you then apply it to get the compliance model that you want.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's been fantastic to have you on the show today. It's so helpful, such great practical, up-to-the-minute advice as well. Next week, we'll be covering privacy by design, so please tune in at 2 p.m. then. And all of our previous sessions have been recorded, and you can find them on our website, privacyculture.com. Okay, looking forward to seeing you again very, very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.